Background: I am 20 years old. I have had many psychedelic experiences since I was about 15, so is my friend who was with me for this trip. I first tried LSD at 15 and I fell in love with it. Since then I have taken LSD about 15 more times, as well as several experiences with psilocybin mushrooms, MDMA, 2CB, and once with 2C-I. This report is about that 2C-I experience. I have always been able to keep a good head even through difficult experiences with psychedelics, and I did manage to hold it together, just about, throughout this trip. I am writing this report as a warning, to be extremely careful when dosing research chemicals such as 2C-I. If the wrong person takes too much, things can go horribly wrong, as you will see in this story. It was a warm evening in London and I received a call from a source explaining that he had acquired 2C-I recently. My friend and I, let's call him Z, had planned on taking a psychedelic in the day for a few weeks but had never got around to it. But since today we were both free, we decided to take the opportunity to try 2C-I. We had researched 2C-I prior to taking it, as we did with every new drug, and had a vague idea of what to expect. It was our first time. So Z and I picked up from our source at around 6:30 p.m. We swallowed one capsule each, supposedly containing 25 milligrams of 2C-I, at around 6:45 p.m. We knew this was a strong dose but had heard of people taking it before and figured it would be intense, but manageable. We then made a plan of what we would do for the duration of the trip. We decided to go and sit by the River Thames and take walks up and down the river to keep ourselves occupied. We would then make our way back to my friend's house when we got bored. We sat by the river as the effects began to creep over us. First we felt quite strong stimulation, similar to amphetamines. My hands shook slightly and I began to feel this throughout my entire body, although it was subtle. After about an hour we both began to notice trails as people walked past us, and as we moved our hands in the air. This was cool. After walking around for a couple of hours we figured that being near roads wasn't fun, it was too loud and it felt dangerous. Our visuals were becoming more intense. So we walked back to where we were originally sitting by the river. By this point the grass was swirling around and we could see geometric patterns all over it. Although it was quite intense, it was really entertaining for us both. Around 3 hours into the trip, we were still sitting by the river. It was beginning to get dark. Z was beginning to get paranoid, fearing that we might get robbed sitting where we were, even though the area was particularly safe. I tried to explain that we were safe and that there were lots of other people sitting nearby so that it was unlikely anybody would rob us here. Regardless, Z's paranoia increased, as well as both our hallucinations. People's faces began to look quite sinister looking. This was quite frightening. About 4 hours into the trip and the view of London was extremely colorful. The sky was filled with geometric shapes, like a kaleidoscope, changing colors from red, to purple, to green. The details on the buildings were moving around, similar to LSD but slightly more profound. It was extremely intense, the most intense hallucinations either of us had experienced. Flashing colors and sparkles engulfed our vision, making it very difficult to read words or even see the time. Z's paranoia was still increasing and I decided it was probably best if we tried to make our way home. Z didn't like the idea but I explained that it might reduce some of the paranoia if we left this area. I grabbed him and we began making our way home. Z began saying things along the lines of, music, family, friends. They are so important. And trying to list as many things he felt were important in life that he could. Z kept turning back as though he was frightened of going near roads and busy streets. He stopped making sense in what he was saying, completely random phrases. I managed to drag him onto a train. I wasn't sure if this was a good idea but I was slightly panicking and felt like we had to get out of the busy city. By the time we got onto the train everything was going crazy, to the point where I could hardly notice what was happening. I could see the reflections of everyone on the train all around me and they were all staring at us because Z was shouting and freaking out. We got back to Z's hometown and figured we would have to walk to his house. This concept wouldn't process with him and he began running around the street shouting and screaming. He wanted the trip to end. Completely random thoughts were going through both of our minds. I couldn't make sense of anything. What time is it? What is time? Does time even exist? How long am I going to be like this, I thought. Although I was not quite on the same level as Z, I was still very confused and slightly frightened. It got to a point, after trying to figure out the best way to get home, when Z insisted I called an ambulance. He explained how on the train we saw himself die, and that he saw his throat get cut. This freaked me out a bit but I tried to make light of it and explained how it was just a hallucination. This didn't make him feel any better. He wanted it to stop, and I was beginning to agree. I called an ambulance. The ambulance arrived and took Z away. Another one came to get me. I didn't see Z for about 4 hours after the ambulance came. I got to the hospital and was made to sit in the waiting room. The patterns on the floor were moving around like crazy, very much like the scene in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas when Raoul Duke is in the hotel after taking LSD. This was great. I was still in a confused headspace, and my thoughts were completely random and looping, which was kind of scary. But the visuals kept me entertained before they hooked me up to their machines and took a blood sample. I was paranoid of the doctors and questioned their reasons for taking my blood, but I just accepted what was happening and let them continue. I was okay, and not in any particular danger, but they kept me in for a couple of hours. Eventually Z came and found me. He said we could leave, and that we never needed to be here in the first place. I agreed. He seemed to have calmed down a lot, so I figured we could spend the rest of the trip at his house, relaxing. We walked home from the hospital. During the walk, Z began to lose the ability to talk. The trees are made of loads of tiny squares. But as he finished a sentence, he would stop on the last word and hum it, as though something was stopping him say it. He blamed it on the squares that everything was made up of. This continued getting worse until he could hardly speak anymore. We arrived back at his house. I was ready to chill out until we sobered up. Although my thoughts were still confused and looping. I didn't really want to talk much, so I just agreed with everything Z said about the squares and how he could feel the nerves in his body. It did make sense. He wasn't talking complete nonsense, or so it seemed at the time. He was really enjoying himself at this point. Z's mind was clearly racing, everything he thought, he said, or tried to say. And his inability to speak seemed to be getting worse. I began to get a bit worried. Z decided to roll a spliff, bad idea. It was about 7 a.m., we started smoking the spliff, which began making my mind race even more. Then, he suddenly jumped up, went rigid and collapsed through his living room table. He began to fit and his face turned blue/gray. I freaked out and tried to calm him down. He wasn't responding. I was forced to call another ambulance. I thought he was going to die. I was running around frantically trying to find the address for the ambulance. I was struggling to stay calm. My mind was going crazy. What have we done? Is he going to die? Fuck. The ambulance arrived. Z was sitting up right now but was completely out of it. He couldn't remember his name. His eyes were empty holes. He couldn't communicate with the paramedics. I tried to explain the situation as well as I could, but I was in a state. In the ambulance, Z started freaking out and trying to escape, and they were forced to strap him down to the stretcher. He couldn't give the paramedics any details, his mother's phone number or even his mother's name. We arrived at the hospital and I sat in the waiting room, again. I could hear Z screaming and shouting in the room nearby. He was paranoid that the nurses were trying to access his mind with all the wires they had attached to him, and he began to pull them out. "You can't do this. It isn't legal. You can't use this in court. I'm going to sue," as well as a lot of complete nonsense. Security was brought in to keep him from escaping. He was going psychotic. It reminded me of the Jefferson Street incident. Eventually I was hooked up to another machine. This time I was freaking out more, seeing my friend going so insane. I thought he was going to lose his mind forever. I couldn't think about the situation rationally. I lay in the bed trying to sleep it off, but I couldn't. I still felt very stimulated and I was still hallucinating quite a lot. The floor still looked amazing. The doctors were confused that I hadn't reacted the ways he had, even though we had taken the same drug. By about midday I was told to go home as I was safe. The last thing I heard was that they had given Z about 25 milligrams of diazepam and it wasn't working. I went home. I assumed that they would get him to sleep eventually and he would wake up later, either completely fine or completely insane. I lay in bed until about midnight. I watched about 5 movies as I couldn't bear the silence as my thoughts were freaking me out. I was worried about Z. Is he ever going to be the same again? I couldn't stop thinking about seeing him fit. It was horrible. I went on the computer once I figured that I wasn't going to be able to sleep. It was about 2 a.m. and Z came online. He had self-discharged and was at his friend's house. I was relieved. He was okay.